Good afternoon. My name is Val Jackson, and my co-moderator today is David Laszakovits, who's the ABR Director of External Relations. Thanks for joining us on today's ABR Update webinar session. Today's session is scheduled for 60 minutes and is being recorded. To minimize potential distractions and interruptions, all webinar participants have been muted. We'll make sure to save plenty of time for questions at the end of the session. To submit a question, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. This will open the question and answer window in the webinar interface. Type your questions into the box provided and click the send button to submit your question to the webinar moderators. We'll answer as many of the submitted questions as possible in the time available at the end of the webinar session. Our speakers today are Drs. Brent Wagner, Vince Mathews, and Liz Oates. Brent is the current ABR president and a private practice radiologist from Reading, Pennsylvania. Vince is the current ABR president-elect and chair of radiology at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Liz is the current ABR nuclear radiology trustee and chair of radiology at the University of Kentucky. So I want to thank our panelists in advance for their time today. And we'll go ahead with Brent, who's going to be talking about ABR certification issues. Brent?
Thanks, Val. On behalf of the ABR, I want to welcome everyone for being here and thank you for being here. It's really, to take time out of your busy day is important to us to be able to hear this message, and we look forward to hearing your questions and feedback. Basically, the emphasis for today's session is going to be a little different from our typical annual update, and that is we're going to concentrate on the current disruptions related to COVID-19. I know they've meant a lot to your departments, your programs, and yourselves. And of course, the ABR has had to make some adjustments as well in order to be flexible with respect to candidates and diplomates and the exam processes. But I want to share in advance the perspective that we have to start with when we have these discussions at the ABR. It really is based on the mission. And just as a reminder, our mission to certify that our diplomates demonstrate requisite knowledge, skill, and understanding of the disciplines to the benefit of patients really is intended to serve the long-term interests of the profession. And the emphasis is on the patient. And that is that ultimately the ABR wouldn't exist if not for the understanding that our professional commitment, that is the ones that you and I share, are important to benefit patients. That is in terms of the training, the expertise that we bring, and the knowledge that we bring to our workplace every day. So with this in mind, when we make some of the adjustments, although they may seem somewhat capricious or perhaps arbitrary, in fact, they're well thought out in terms of what they mean to the mission of the ABR and what that means to the long-term interest of you as radiology professionals. Now, there are challenges related to these rescheduled exams. And I'm sure you would be aware of many of these. For one, we had diverse preferences among the stakeholders. Specifically, some candidates said, they didn't want us to delay the test. Now, I think when we had to make that decision back in March to give adequate lead time to the candidates, I think there were a lot of people who thought, well, let's tough it out and see what happens. There were a great many of our candidates and program directors and radiology chairs who felt we should delay the exam, and hence it was postponed, as you know. Programs and departments, of course, are also impacted by these same decisions, not just the candidates. So we understand that, and we understand there were diverse preferences, but in general, it seemed like the reasonable thing to do, and I think we would all agree on that today, was to postpone the exam toward the end of this year, hoping that things return more toward normal at that time. And that's the second issue, really, is the uncertainty of the return toward normal. Not just the timing as to when it might occur, but what's the new normal going to look like? Are we going to be able to administer examinations in the ways that we were used to doing before? And what's it going to mean for the candidates who are preparing for the test, et cetera? So with this in mind, we also had to consider this when we were looking at the challenges of rescheduling the exams. We also have dependence on outside organizations. Most importantly, perhaps, our contracted entity that administers some of our exams in Pearson VUE centers. It doesn't really apply to diagnostic radiology, but some of our other tests are administered in centers across the country, And of course, they closed down for months and really are just now starting to talk about reopening and reopening probably on a limited basis moving forward. So we're dependent on them. In other words, it wasn't necessarily our decision to postpone an exam or cancel an exam, but in fact, they just said, well, we're not available to give those tests. And I'm sure you can understand that as well. There, of course, could be local restrictions as well, even that would apply to our test centers. So the exam center we have in Chicago, depending on what the local decisions are and restrictions are, they might say, well, no, you can't have groups of people of that size convening to take an exam in our exam center, even though we would control sort of the opening and closing and operations of that. So acknowledging all of that, how much lead time is reasonable and necessary? And that's sort of the difficult question for us, is that we don't want people to go through the emotional and intellectual exercise of preparing for an exam that then isn't held. And so with that in mind, we realize this is not as simple as, for example, canceling even a large meeting, because people have to prepare for this test. We understand that, and we certainly don't want to create more anxiety than we need to. So all this really is sort of the combination of things that really were the problems and the challenges we faced in making these decisions. Well, our goals were to offer reasonable flexibility, and that would be mostly for the candidates, but also for programs and departments, meaning that their staffing, of course, could be impacted by when the exams were rescheduled and in what way were they postponed and with what lead time. So with this in mind, we would then also want to make sure that we want to minimize the anxiety I alluded to earlier. We understand this is sometimes a difficult process. I think as people prepare for the test, they certainly are going to be undergoing more stress than usual. You add that to the stress of a viral pandemic, and of course it just is synergistic in terms of what it means to the candidates. So we want to make sure there's adequate lead time to prepare, and we all have to acknowledge we don't know for sure what the new normal will look like, and we're going to have to be prepared to make adjustments as we move forward in this regard. But we really want to make sure that the integrity of the process is maintained. And this is critical because we don't want the certificate to have any less value than it does now. That is, when you go in front of an insurance company or a credentialer at a hospital or even your colleagues, you want board certification to mean something. And the reason we all would want that is that it's a lot of work and it requires a lot of skill and a lot of talent. So with that in mind, we really want to make sure that the process has the same integrity, has the same rigor behind it that it did before. I saw recently, I'm sure many of you saw that there are some states who are waiving requirements for driver's license tests. And, that may work for a driver's license. It's a little scary, I think, to think about a 16-year-old out there for the first time behind the wheel. But I understand, and I understand that. But you might look at it differently if we're really talking about someone who now has the sort of a shortcut, if you will, to board certification. It's intended to be rigorous. It's intended to have value, and it's because of the consistency and integrity of the process itself. So the rationale and the thought process we went to was to recognize this impact. Most of our board members are or have been involved as program directors, department chairs, active faculty in a broad range of departments. These are not people who fail to understand what this means in an academic teaching environment and what it means to the candidates, of course, all of our board members, of course, have gone through this process. But I think more importantly, they work alongside the candidates now, or they have in the past. These are people who understand the ramifications of these sorts of things. And then they apply that as we try to make reasonable decisions. We want to minimize the impact of the pandemic on achieving board certification. Now, what we mean by that is that if delays are needed, that is extensions of board eligibility, et cetera, the American Board of Medical Specialties has alluded to this interest in making sure that no one should have their board certification directly impacted as a result of this. And what that's generally going to mean is we're going to allow more time for the process to play out and more flexibility in when, sort of the timing of when an individual candidate might pursue their examinations and achievement of board certification. And we are actively seeking input from partners in this process overall, and that would be organizations such as the Association of Program Directors in Radiology. We're interested in making sure that we've heard a lot of different opinions on what might work, what is least disruptive, what is most reasonable, again, acknowledging that we want to make sure that the process is consistent with the intent and with our experience overall to make sure we issue a certificate that has value, that recognizes the hard work that went into it. Now, one particular question I'll finish with is, why can't exams be given remotely? It's a logical question to some degree. It really is somewhat elusive when it comes to having a practical solution to some of the problems. And we do look at innovative ways, and I would anticipate as the technology matures that we're going to see opportunities to make sure the test still has that credibility, has that validity, but at the same time is less burdensome for candidates and diplomats. It's just not there yet. We consistently sit down and kind of look at, well, what are the technology options? What could be done to make this remote? And there just aren't practical ways to do it. We did, as you know, just last year, institute the online longitudinal assessment that Dr. Mathews is going to talk about in a few minutes for maintenance of certification. And that was a substitute for an in-person examination at Chicago or Tucson. But I want to point out that assessment is different. It is different because it has both summative informative functions, that is, it's intended to recognize gaps and also allow individuals to address the gaps in their knowledge. And me, for example, as a test taker, if I get a question wrong, I get some sort of instant remediation, and I get an opportunity to learn from that experience. And of course, the initial certification tests, both the core and the initial certifying exam, are not intended to do that. So there is a difference, and I just wanted to recognize, we acknowledge that there's a difference in these exams. The assessment of OLA is different from from initial certification. We have to acknowledge that. So, but that said, we are still looking for innovations, looking for ways to make these exams different in the way they're given, so that they're less onerous, that they're less disruptive to individuals. We just want to make sure that we keep in mind fairness, security, and the reproducibility of the test. And these are difficult. These are difficult to maintain at the same time allowing the exam to be given across the country in different environments. And we run into issues in the diagnostic radiology world, specifically with image quality, but in addition, of course, the test environment itself. So our goal, again, is to maintain the value of the certificate for the public and, by extension, the individual. And we are looking for practical ways to be able to do that, but they are much harder to develop than merely flipping a switch and saying we're going to do this remotely in some way, in some distributed fashion. But it's not to say we shouldn't be trying and looking at that consideration moving forward. So again, I want to thank you for your time today. I hope this has been useful. We are very interested in hearing your thoughts on what we might do differently, and your thoughts on what we should consider as we make these decisions in the future. And at this point, I'll turn things over to Dr. Vince Mathews.
Thanks. So as Brent mentioned, I'm going to talk about OLA and give you an update on where we are here nearly a year and a half into the start of this program. As you know, ABR OLA is designed to replace the every 10-year MOC Part 3 exam. ABR was not the first to introduce these longitudinal assessments. The first was the American Board of Anesthesia, but subsequently the vast majority of the ABMS member boards have introduced an OLA type MOC process. So what's the rationale for this? One, as Brent mentioned, it improves the formative aspects of the assessment, obviously much different than our previous computer-based exams. It better supports more specific areas of clinical practice. It's a more convenient assessment approach, obviously, since there's no travel involved. But on the other hand, it also maintains a rigorous evaluation of diplomate knowledge and also supports continuous professional development through lifelong learning, which is very important. And then finally, the target for
OLA content is walking around knowledge. This is obviously much different than our prior computerized exams, but these are the type of questions that you may get from colleagues, referring physicians, trainees, and patients. So the target for OLA is different than our certifying exams. As far as the implementation, we've done this in 3 phases. The first phase was in the latter half of 2018. In that phase, we had over 1,000 diplomates volunteer to help us verify the distribution, scoring process, and feedback processes of the platform, as well as give us input on diplomate acceptance and how we can make things more efficient and more effective for the diplomate to use the tool. Then in phase 2, which launched early in 2019 and was through that entire calendar year, we launched OLA to all of our diagnostic radiology MOC participants. And then phase 3 began at the beginning of this year, where we then introduced OLA to all the MOC participants in our other specialties: interventional radiology, radiation oncology, and medical physics. I just want to point out that diplomates with a lifetime certificate may voluntarily enroll in MOC and participate in OLA, but they have to meet all the other requirements of MOC. They do not give up their lifetime certificate by doing so. So the process for diagnostic radiology is a little different in that diplomates create a profile of the subspecialty areas that most closely fit what they do. So it's a practice profile assessment. Whereas in interventional radiology, radiation oncology, and medical physics, to this point, there is no practice profiling. It's one assessment for all the diplomates. As you know, you get weekly emails that have links to questions that are relevant to the practice profile, so 2 question opportunities per week, and the diplomates may opt in or out of the questions each week. They don't have to answer them. But once a question's open, there's a limited time to answer. Diplomates learn immediately whether they answered the question correctly, so there's immediate feedback, and then they also receive a rationale for the answer and references. Topics that are answered incorrectly are then repeated more frequently to gauge whether the material is learned. So there's actually a spaced learning component of OLA. And so this provides an opportunity for continuous diplomate feedback, which is one of the things that has been requested by diplomates over the years. There's one item set for each certificate. This is a little nuance for diagnostic radiology in that we dual purpose subspecialty content, so that if you have a subspecialty certificate in, for example, neuroradiology, using the item set for neuroradiology also can be used for your primary certificate in diagnostic radiology. If you have 2 subspecialty certificates, say neuroradiology and pediatric radiology, you actually have 2 item sets for each of those certificates. There's 104 opportunities provided each year, so there's 2 questions per week, but diplomates are only required to answer 52 per year, so this provides some flexibility in when you actually need to be engaged in OLA. And there are up to 10 declines per item set per year, so that means if you open a question, you can decline it if it's not in your specific area. So for example, if you're an abdominal radiologist but you don't do prostate MR, and you get a prostate MR question, you can decline that question. So it allows for some increase in granularity of the practice profile. Content's administered weekly, but there's a 4-week shelf life so that you can answer up to 8 questions at a time every 4 weeks. We get a lot of questions about the OLA performance review, and the annual performance evaluation will occur yearly after the diplomate reaches a 200 item threshold. So in the year that they answer 200 questions, at the end of that calendar year, they will actually undergo their annual performance evaluation. But after that, and soon for everyone, there will be an ongoing current cumulative score provided to the diplomates. So Our intention is to provide this weekly after 52 questions have been answered. We haven't rolled that out yet, but that will be coming soon, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So to meet your Part 3 requirement for MOC, you must pass the most recent performance evaluation at your annual review, or you must have passed a traditional exam in the past 5 years. Now, OLA is criterion referenced, so just like all of our other exams, we use the Angoff process. So each question is evaluated individually, and then the aggregate rating for the diplomate's 200 questions is their specific passing standard. And all OLA participants have the option to serve as a question rater and participate in this question rating process. All you have to do is watch an online video that explains that process and then take a short quiz. So if someone is not meeting the passing standard at their annual performance, there's 2 ways for remediation. One is they can answer additional OLA questions, and if their performance rises above the passing standard at any time over the 12 months between their annual reviews, their MOC status will immediately change from not meeting to meeting the requirements for MOC. So you can improve your status in between annual reviews, but your status will never be downgraded between annual reviews. And then the second pathway for remediation is to take and pass a traditional exam. So doing so will ensure that your Part 3 status will remain meeting for 5 years, and then after passing that exam, your OLA will be reset and any previous scoring deficit will be removed. This summarizes where we are currently as of the beginning of May. We've had over 29,000 diplomates answer at least one OLA question, so they've started the process. That's 96% of eligible diplomates. As I mentioned, the 3 specialties of interventional radiology, radiation oncology, and medical physics just started, so some of their diplomates may not have answered questions yet, but it will still have 6 months to actually answer all the 52 questions they need after July. So, and we just passed 200 million OLA questions being answered in the beginning of this month. Less than 3% of all questions viewed have been declined, and 35% of participants have begun the OLA rating process. So that's actually increased over the last several months. Question response times, for the 60-second questions, the average response time is 23 seconds, and for the 180-second questions, it's 30 seconds. So the response times are well within the allotted time, but as I mentioned, we've made some adjustments, and I'll talk about some of the adjustments we've made in the response times, because we don't want this to be a test of speed. This is really a test of knowledge. Here are the diagnostic radiology practice profiles for 2019. You see on the left the clinical areas selected from the most to the least. So you see general diagnostic radiology is actually the most commonly selected clinical practice area, and then on down to cardiac being the least selected. About 30% of diplomates choose one clinical area, so all of their content is in one specific subspecialty area. 20%, 21% choose 2, and about 50% choose 3 clinical areas for their OLA content. We performed a satisfaction survey in the early part of 2020 to get feedback for the first year's experience. So we sent a survey to 1,000 randomly selected OLA participants who had answered at least 25 OLA questions. 300 responded. Now, just to cover a couple points to that, between 70 and 80% of diplomates indicated that their OLA participation helped them remediate clinical knowledge gaps, identify clinical knowledge gaps, and that it positively impacted their clinical work. Nearly 98% indicated that the site was easy to use and the system overall was easy to use. So they 98% either agreed or strongly disagreed, or strongly agreed or agreed with that statement. And then as far as rating their overall satisfaction with OLA, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best, you see here that over 80% of diplomates either rated OLA 4 stars or 5 stars, with the average being 4.2 stars. And here are just a few of the comments, and we've been getting very positive comments about OLA since the initial launch at the meetings that we've attended and various forums that we've held. But here you see one diplomate says they look forward to seeing the questions each week. Another says it's a very non-intrusive way of participating in MOC. It's outstanding. Another says they enjoy it, and that's what we heard from a lot of people, is that they really actually enjoy it and they think it's fun. And then finally, another diplomat indicates that they use this to tailor their ongoing CME when they're able to identify their strengths and weaknesses through the formative aspects of OLA. But we continue to make improvements in OLA. We launched it, and we get a lot of feedback and have listened and tried to make it better, and we will continue to do so. For example, at the beginning of this year, we added emergency radiology as a diagnostic radiology practice profile area. We've provided more time for selected questions. Questions that have multiple images will now be 180-second or 3-minute questions. There were some diplomates who felt like they didn't have enough time to fully evaluate the case that was presented, and so as I mentioned before, we don't want to make this a test of speed. It's really a test of knowledge. Several diplomates have asked about getting CME requirements for participating in OLA. That would require some expense and a lot of administrative effort. So instead of offering CME, what we've done is we've provided a reduction in the self-assessment CME requirements if you're participating in OLA. So at each year, at your annual review, you're required to have at least 25 self-assessment CMEs over the previous 3-year period, and we've reduced that to 15 for those who are participating in OLA. Coming in the next few months will be the ability to modify the frequency of your OLA emails, so that if you don't want to get emails once a week, you'll be able to specify how frequently you want those emails, or if you don't want the emails at all. And then performance feedback, as I mentioned, is coming. That's something that will be introduced mid-year, and we'll have webinars and other opportunities to answer questions regarding this. But we want to begin to provide feedback on an ongoing basis to diplomates after they've answered 52 questions, so that they, even though it's not a psychometrically valid pass-fail assessment at that point, at least it gives the diplomates an indication of where they are performing relative to the standards. So that's something we've been asked a lot for, and will be forthcoming in the next couple months as well. So thank you for your attention. There's a lot of information on the website. We have an FAQ section that answers a lot of specific questions about OLA, and so I would direct you to that, but we'll have some time for questions at the end of this, the next presentation. So I'd like to introduce Liz Oates, who's going to talk about nuclear radiology and some of the enhancements to that certification process. Liz?
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about the 16-month pathway leading to certification in nuclear radiology. So let's start with some background data. When we compare 2019-2020 to 10 years ago, you can see how there's been a rather precipitous drop in the number of nuclear training programs as well as nuclear trainees. And as you all know, the nuclear trainee can be a nuclear radiologist or a nuclear medicine physician. And the number of nuclear medicine programs, again, has dropped rather sharply over the past 10 years. So there's really a need for a mechanism to train nuclear practitioners. Thus, we have our nuclear radiology pathway that can be completed within 16 months during a standard diagnostic radiology residency program. We are leveraging that elective time that has been built in to the diagnostic radiology and even the interventional radiology residency programs. There's a demand for subspecialty expertise as we have more and more hybrid technologies and more therapeutic radiopharmaceuticals. The radiologists that we train and we certify are holistic in that they are grounded in multimodality, anatomical, and physiologic imaging, and can put things together to have an integrated diagnosis and treatment plan. And one of the real advantages is shown at the bottom of this slide, and that is that within the 4 years, we can build in essentially a fellowship, and then the graduate from the DR program can do a traditional fellowship on top of the embedded fellowship. So they will be, in 5 years of radiology, they will actually be the equivalent of double subspecialty trained. So they can do, for example, neuroradiology after nuclear radiology, or abdominal radiology after nuclear radiology, and so on. Nuclear radiology is synergistic to many of the other subspecialties we have in our field of radiology. So this summarizes what the pathway looks like. This is the pathway that was launched in 2017. And you can see that any diagnostic radiology or even an interventional radiology program can participate. And I will show you the data of the participating programs in one moment. The 16 months are made up of 12 months of traditional nuclear radiology or nuclear medicine, but the other 4 months can be in related fields, such as abdomen or chest or head and neck radiology, and so on. The scheduling is quite flexible. The resident can actually begin to get, quote, more nuclear training in year 1 or year 2. It does not have to wait until the R4 year to be crammed in at the end. It can be spread out depending on how the residency program wants to do it. It's very flexible. 2 modalities are required, and these are fairly standard, and I don't think any program would have trouble having PET-CT and SPECT-CT experience for the radiology resident. In terms of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the graduate should be able to meet the 35,390, and that includes the parenteral therapies. And so the 700 hours must include 200 hours, not just 80 hours, but 200 hours of classroom and laboratory. And the therapy experience for the 16-month pathway graduate is greater than for the standard diagnostic radiology resident. 10 therapies of hyperthyroid instead of 3, 5 of thyroid cancer instead of 3, and 5 parenteral therapies, such as lutetium-177 dotatate, just as one example. Please note that Y90 microspheres are not parenteral therapies, in that they are devices and not unsealed sources. The sequential certificates. Currently, the graduate will take the diagnostic radiology certification examination just like everyone else. A year later, they can sit for the nuclear radiology certification examination. And so they will have, as was just said in Vince's talk, there will be one maintenance of certification process through OLA that will continuously certify the nuclear radiologists, both in nuclear radiology and in diagnostic radiology, in the same OLA process. So let's look at some of the data now. So this is from 2017, when the program, the pathway first started. And you can see that we have close to 100 enrollees at this point. 51 participating residencies. That's about a quarter of all of the diagnostic radiology programs in our country. About half of them have a nuclear residency or a fellowship or residency within the program, and half of them do not. And then you can see the DR complement of the programs at the bottom of the slide. And you can see that small programs have opportunity to participate just as much as large programs. And in point of fact, the sort of mid-sized programs, smaller to mid-size, have more enrollees than the tail ends. But any size residency can accommodate this pathway if they so choose. Here's the list of current participating programs, just listed alphabetically. Let's look at the pipeline. We began back in 2017, so the first graduates were in June of 2018. And then every year there's a new crop of graduates as they enroll and they graduate. So you can see that the 2018 enrollees took the DR certification examination in 2019 and are scheduled this fall to take the subspecialty certification examination. So of those who are eligible, 5 of 11 have signed up to take the nuclear radiology subspecialty examination in the fall. And the registration is still open through the end of May, so there might be a few more that might sign up. The enrollment is on a rolling basis. There's no timeline. We have candidates enrolling, almost every day. And I look forward to seeing emails from the ABR telling me that there's a new application from a new program. It's very easy to complete the documents. They're very quick and easy, and this is the website. Let me say this is one slide I have on the NRC requirements during the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is currently no recommended change in the training and experience requirements. So the training and experience requirements that are in place that are codified by the NRC for our training programs have not been modified at this point in time, but the NRC staff is considering its recommendations, but at this time, status quo, no changes. And that's all I have to say right now. Happy to entertain questions. Now, Val and David will be the moderators for the question and answer session.
Thank you, Brent, Vince, and Liz. And we have a number of questions that have been submitted online. David, should you and I take turns with these, or do you want to handle them? How would you like to do this?
Yeah, I've got a kind of a plan of attack, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Great. So let's start with, since Dr. Oates just finished with her questions that have been submitted. The first question, Dr. Oates, regarding your content is this available at a residency programs that does not have a nuclear medicine fellowship at our institution?
Yes, half of the programs do not have a companion program in nuclear medicine or nuclear radiology. So that's one of the advantages of this pathway. Any diagnostic radiology residency in this country can participate if it would like to, assuming it can meet the other requirements, such as having PET CT or SPECT CT. You do not need a companion nuclear program at your institution.
Great. Another related question, Dr. Oates. At our institution, low-dose radioiodine therapies are much less common than high-dose therapies. How can we meet the 10 low and 5 high requirement when low-dose cases are so difficult to obtain?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know who does them at your institution, but hyperthyroidism is commonly treated with radioactive iodine. If at your institution, the endocrinologists or the radiation oncologists are doing those therapies, then I think you would need to make a an arrangement with those others to let your resident participate in those therapies. So I don't really know the particulars. You may need to, if you have a multiple site residency, perhaps the therapies could be performed at one of the institutional affiliates and not at the mother program, if that's the problem. So it really depends on your particulars, but those therapies must be met. 10 must be in the less than 30, equal to or less than 33, and 5 need to be greater than 33. So there usually is a way to work this out, and I'd be glad to, speak to the individual to try to help out in person on a case-by-case basis.
Great. Another question. If a resident is one short of their I-131 low dose requirement, what are the options for making this up?
Well, again, to do it within the pathway and to do it, you have to do it before you graduate, but there are other mechanisms to become an authorized user that's outside of the ABR. So, there are other ways, alternate pathways to become an authorized user by having your training and experience validated by your residency and submitted directly to the agreement state through your institution where you're practicing. But if you don't have the therapy, then I think you're in trouble, really. You need to get those therapies to be an authorized user, either in your residency or get it after you graduate and have it documented by another authorized user and submit it outside of the board pathway.
All right, and one final question related to your presentation. How is this different from the NMDR residency?
Well, there are some combined 5-year programs, and there are very few of them. And the medical student will match into those programs because they are a 5-year combined nuclear diagnostic radiology program. Again, just a handful of those, and they generally emphasize more nuclear. I would have to look at the particulars, but often it's more like 18 months or even 24 months of nuclear out of the 5-year combined program. And again, the real advantage of this 16-month pathway is that it is done within the traditional 48-month diagnostic radiology residency. So it just, those programs are few and far between, but I think they will produce a very qualified nuclear practitioner, perhaps someone who is more likely to be a university-based researcher, for example, as opposed to a clinical practitioner in the community or in a traditional academic medical center faculty.
Great. There are a few other additional questions related to your presentation information for those that submitted those, so we can have some time for the other questions that have been asked regarding OLA and also the examinations, the initial certification examinations, and some of the content that Dr. Wagner presented. We're going to skip those, but we will answer them. So at the end of this, the staff from APDR and AUR are going to give us the listing of all these questions, and we will get back to you regarding these additional questions related to virtual telemedicine observations for iodine therapy. So we will get to those. I'm going to move on to the questions that have been submitted about OLA. The first question relates to the self-assessment CME credits. Is the reduction of required self-assessment CME credits per 3-year period effective immediately or after the next look back?
Well, David, you probably know better than I, but I believe I think we implemented it this year.
We did. So yeah, I can help. So it's available once you've answered a year's worth of questions. So those in diagnostic radiology who began OLA in 2019, if you answered all of your 52 questions in 2019, then when you went to complete your your MOC attestation earlier this year, you would have seen your self-assessment requirement change from 15 self-assessment CME in the previous 3-year period to to the lower CME, SACME requirement. So it actually is reflected every year. As long as you're meeting your OLA progress requirement for the year, which is answering your 52 questions, then your self-assessment CME requirement would be reduced the next year during your look back.
It doesn't change the overall CME requirement, though. That still remains at 75. So.
That's correct. That's a good point. A couple of more questions about OLA. Next question is, can the ABR change the OLA expiration time of 4 weeks? In general, but especially given COVID, why such a firm time frame?
Yeah, we continue to talk about ways to sort of modify the program and make it more user-friendly. Now, we haven't planned to do anything immediately related to COVID. And as you know, you're only required to answer 52 questions a year. So if, you know, in the months of March and April, if you were very busy, although many of us were not, you could skip those 2 months and you still would have plenty of time to answer questions and get your 52 questions. So that's one of the things that we tried to do when we designed the program, was to give it a lot of flexibility. So individuals theoretically could take a year off. They could answer all the questions in the first 6 months of a year, not answer any questions in the second 6 months, not answer any questions in the first 6 months of the following year, and then go back into OLA. So we try to make it fairly flexible with the requirement of only 52 questions out of 104 opportunities. So we haven't made any adjustments now. It's come up a couple times, but we haven't pursued that.
All right. Another OLA question: can the software start providing explanations for decline questions? Seems like it's a lost educational opportunity.
Yeah, that's something we can take into account. I mean, I think the thing with the decline questions is that you don't see the answers or anything, and the intent is for that is that it's not a question that is relevant to your practice, and we're trying to assess your actual clinical practice. But that's something we can take under advisement and discuss further.
All right. Another question regarding OLA remediation. Will remediation questions be available on demand, or will diplomates need to wait for the standard 2 questions each week to remediate over a short period of time?
We haven't planned to change the frequency of the question opportunities. So the intention currently is for the remediation to occur over the normal course of the OLA process. But it is something we could talk about, particularly as there's test registration deadlines that will need to be met. Of course, we're not far enough along the program for anyone to be affected by that at this point, but it is something we can think about the logistics, how that might look, but that's not our intention currently.
All right. Let's see here. There was another one. I can help with this one too if you need, Dr. Mathews. The next question regarding OLA, and we'll probably make this the last one so we can save the remainder of the time for other questions for Dr. Wagner. When we write a review after answering an OLA question, is there a way to know what action was taken for that particular question?
Yeah, David, you can probably answer that. I mean, I think at this point, you know, we have software that tracks when we do get feedback, and but I don't believe we've really developed a process for giving individual feedback as far as I'm aware of. David, do you know?
Yeah, so the way this works, so we collect the individual feedback in the open text areas in a variety of places for the OLA question. That feedback is collated and actually provided back to the committees, the volunteer committees that create that content, so that they can review it and modify questions as it's needed. If we find that generally, you know, we've had question commentary that, hey, this is a great question, great learning opportunity, but as you might imagine, the feedback generally is, hey, I don't necessarily agree with that answer choice, or I didn't like the rationale, or there's a better reference, or this answer option was really close to the correct answer and may be confusing, those types of things. So if we find that we have enough feedback on a question and can also see from the question data, the statistics, the psychometric statistics, that it's not performing well, we actually may eliminate a question from scoring, and you would absolutely know if that would happen. If you look in your MyOLA history, you can actually see if that has happened to a question. So if you've provided feedback on a specific question, again, it's not going to be something that happens immediately, because it needs to go back to the committee through a normal committee review process, and the committee would look at it and say, hey, yeah, this question isn't performing terribly well. We've also had some feedback on it. And based on the performance and the feedback, we're going to remove this question. And if that happens, what happens is that the question is actually scored correctly for you, whether or not you've answered the question correctly or incorrectly. So that means you actually get credit for it. So it counts as one of your 52 required responses for the year, and you get it's scored for you as if you answered it correctly, even if you hadn't. And again, just to make sure you understand, that information is posted in MyOLA history. So if that happens to one of the questions that you answered, it would say that definitively in your MyOLA history for that specific question. All right, let's move on with the time remaining, about 8 minutes left, to the questions for Dr. Wagner. I think probably in general, there's several questions with the same kind of general question involved, and that is the core, I'll just read one of the questions because it encompasses quite a few of the other questions that are about the same thing. Is the core exam still being held in November, or is that now being moved to 2021 based on the uncertainty of COVID? It was unclear in the first presentation.
Yeah, I apologize. I intentionally did not include the dates. And the reason for that is this is being recorded, which means it could be viewed later. On our website, you can click on the homepage. The first thing you see really is the COVID-19 update, which will give the current exam times. And that is updated daily if need be to reflect where things are now. And that way you don't have to troll through emails and communications and our blog and everywhere else. That is updated as soon as a change is made. And of course, that change will be announced as well. But let me specifically talk about the core exam in November. As it stands right now, we intend to provide that opportunity for individuals to test in November, acknowledging that if there is a lack of return to normalcy, for lack of a better way to say it, we may wind up having to postpone that exam. And as it stands right now, in early 2021, there will be another option. So if people are uncomfortable coming in November and that exam is indeed held, which we expect it to be, then the option is to come back, and it'll be in the first, as I say, in the first calendar quarter of 2021. There's no penalty to take the exam late, meaning that your ultimate board certification date is the same, or could be. I mean, there's no reason it wouldn't be, and there's really no reason if people are uncomfortable coming in November, then I would advise them to plan for the new date. We'll be announcing that date very shortly for the 2021 exam.
Another similar question, it's a little bit different, a little bit of a nuance. Given the potential risk of a second wave in the winter, would it be possible to move the DR core exam earlier to late summer or early fall?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And we brought that up actually when we discussed this about 6 weeks ago. Should we try and hit the sweet spot? I think it was a little less defined as to whether or not there would be sort of a pre-season, if you will, a hiatus from the pandemic that would occur potentially in August. And we realized that's what the models were saying. Our reluctance to do that was, again, getting back to the preparation and to set people up for the idea that we were trying to guess, as is the CDC and everyone else, as to when that would happen. It seemed like too fine a point, really, to try to target a particular 21 or 30-day period when there wouldn't be as much a problem as there might be later. So I admit that was a consideration. We discussed that at length and ultimately decided it'd be better just to push it back as far as possible, acknowledging again that if people were uncomfortable, that they could push this into 2021. I think it's that preparation, it's anxiety and stress around the preparation, because I understand what it would be like if you had to study for a test and prepare for it and rearrange your schedule and then have it not occur. The general understanding, and we did seek out our partners on the education side, who felt that it was probably better just to push it back as long as was reasonable, trying to get a 2020 administration in, acknowledging that we might have to fall back on 2021.
Great, thank you. Another question: how will the core exam administration adhere to social distancing?
We're not. We're still in the process of working out how that would work. We have capacity to deal with significant, if you will, restrictions on what that would mean. For example, we could introduce extra capacity to allow us to test leaving every other workstation unoccupied. And I'm just putting that as an example because that may not be sufficient, nor it may not be necessary. But right now, things like that, we do have capacity to be able to do that, because unlike, as I alluded to earlier, the Pearson VUE centers, we control the environment for the core exam. So the idea would be we would do whatever is required to adhere to the social distancing recommendations and requirements that are in place at the time. Incidentally, one of the problems with using distributed exams is they'll determine for themselves what those are, and presumably those would be quite reasonable as well. So I'm not saying that Pearson VUE would be an unacceptable option for those exams that we do give in those centers. It's just that we'll tailor our exam to make sure that we're meeting those requirements and that we're not providing an unsafe environment. It will meet whatever the recommendation is, and we do have the capacity to make that happen if we need to.
Great. We've got about 2 minutes left, so probably only time for one. There's two questions that are somewhat the same. Has any thought been given to moving the core exam to June of the R4 year this year and then permanently? COVID has given us a perfect opportunity for this to happen, avoiding giving 2 exams in 1 year, which is a burden on departments and programs.
I will admit we had not considered that option. I know Val is taking notes during the session, and as she was for the OLA part, and we can add that to our agenda for our call later this month. I think that's an interesting question. It's not quite as simple as it might seem on the surface, because there were reasons actually provided by people in the training programs, that is faculty members, for wanting to do the exam as early as we did. And it was based partly on if there were problems that a resident would recognize in areas that they wanted to study up on in anticipation of the certifying exam, that they could close those gaps, that they could basically remediate at their own institution. But I think that's an interesting question. I think that's worth considering, and certainly merits more discussion. We'll take a look at that. That's a good question.
We will take a look at that. The other thing to keep in mind is that we did realize that there would be an impact if we couldn't give the core exam this fall and we just had everyone move to next May, June core exam time, that would be a burden for the departments. And that's why we've arranged to have another administration that'll be in February or early March. And we're, again, just finishing up the dates on that so that hopefully departments would not have 2 years worth of residents out of the department.
It's the top of the hour. Did you want to take one more question or end here?
I'm willing to take one more question.
Okay. The question is, what do you guys have to say about remote testing, given that MBME and ABS have moved to do so, the latter with home testing? No one is saying it's easy, but are you really planning on making everyone travel in November? It's a public health risk.
Right. Well, again, we're not, if there's a risk involved, a substantial risk to travel, we're not going to ask people to travel. We'll make allowances that need to be made in that regard. I'm not, I think we're worried about the safety of our staff, but we're very worried about the safety of our candidates, and we're not going to subject people to a requirement that requires them to enter in an unsafe environment. That said, a lot of the move toward remote testing, remember, doesn't rely on images. So most of our requirements to come to an exam center at the ABR are based either on the fact that it's an oral exam, because that construct is felt to have a greater flexibility and fairness for the candidates as they work through clinical problems, whether they be in physics, interventional radiology, or radiation oncology. And then for the diagnostic side, remember, image quality is everything. And what we don't want is for people to be faced with an environment where image quality can't be maintained. So I think we just have to keep that in mind. That's not to say we're not considering exactly that. And when I spoke of innovation earlier, I think it's critical that we consider those kinds of options. Val and I are going to be on a meeting next month with the ABMS, and we'll be listening carefully for ideas around how this might be done differently. And as soon as we can make that done practically at a reasonable cost so that we don't have to raise fees and with reasonable reliability, security, and fairness, I would anticipate we're going to go there. I just need to reemphasize, this is not something that is simply adjusted on the fly for diagnostic radiology, nor for our exams that have an oral exam component. Val, do you have something to add?
Well, the only thing I would add is I'm on calls with the executive directors of all the ABMS boards every 2 weeks or so, and people keep bringing up surgery. You have to keep in mind that surgery's exams are far different than ABRs, especially our diagnostic radiology exams. And so what may work with a huge struggle, because I've talked to the surgery folks, what may work for another board is not necessarily transferable to our board. And so we really have looked at this, and someone just put in here, yeah, we know that NBME has videos and images, but I remember how important really great image quality is to diagnostic radiology over and above what someone would see in an NBME environment. So we continue to look at this, but it is not as easy as it may seem at the outset.
All right. Any closing comments?
Thanks again for being on the call. Appreciate it to everybody who joined us today.
Thanks very
everyone.
much, everyone.
Thank you.